Welcome to the Long Take Review, a film podcast with one eye always on the Oscar race. I'm your host, Jen Bankard, and I'm here with a couple of challengers. First, he always falls apart in the second set. It's PT McNiff. How's it going, PT?
You want my best piece of advice for you? You want me to coach you? Okay. Quit. I'm doing well, Jen. How are you?
Those actually paired really well. I'm doing great. Thank you. I'm really excited to talk about our movie today. And I want him to be my coach. Sorry, PT. It's Antonio Elefano. How's it going, Antonio?
You have a better shot with a handgun in your mouth. It's going great, Jen. I did not mean that. That's just obviously from the movie.
I know. For the record, I thought about that one and then was like, that's too much. So I'm glad you went there. All right. So those were all references to the film we are here to review today, Luca Guadagnino's psychosexual sports drama, Challengers. The film follows a tennis coach and her star player husband who find themselves competing against a former friend and lover. That was writing something that was like spoiler free, but also sort of accurate to this movie was a little bit tough. So yeah, spoiler mode today. Hopefully it will be juicy. The cast is a powerhouse trio. We've got Zendaya, who really needs no introduction. You know who Zendaya is. Mike Feist, you would probably recognize as Riff in West Side Story, the recent West Side Story remake from Steven Spielberg. And Josh O'Connor, who people will probably only know if they've watched The Crown. He plays Prince Charles in The Crown. He has been in a couple other movies, but this, I feel like, is his big breakout role for film. And director Luca Guadagnino, if you don't know, is best known for his 2017 film Call Me by Your Name with Timothée Chalamet. Challengers is it just started playing in theaters this past weekend, and it is an Amazon, like it's technically an MGM Studios production, but it's like the MGM Amazon merger, whatever that is. So that means it'll be streaming on Amazon Prime Video after its theatrical run, presumably. So if you're listening to us for the first time, we will have a spoiler-free section designed for those who have not yet seen the film, right? It just came out. And then we will issue a very clear spoiler alert and shift into spoiler mode for the rest of the show. PT, if listeners think we've completed a grand slam after listening to this episode, I'm really proud of that one. What can they do?
If they don't want to drop any sets in terms of catching new episodes of ours, then they should follow the Long Take Review wherever they get their podcasts. We host the feed on Jen's Substack at thelongtake.substack.com. But you can also find us wherever good podcasts are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, YouTube, and more. On social media, you can follow us on Instagram and Threads at The Long Take Review, and you can follow our profile on Letterboxd at LTR Pod.
Thanks, PT. So we're just about ready to get into our discussion of Challengers, but first we have an incredibly quick, like I promise it will be very quick, movie news update.
Just in off the wire, it's your Hollywood news.
So we only have two pieces of news that I think are really worth talking about, and there's probably not going to be a lot of discussion. It's just sort of like acknowledging that these are things that are happening. One is that Quentin Tarantino announced that he is abandoning the film that he was working on. This was supposed to be his 10th and final film. I believe it was supposed to be, it was called The Critic or The Film Critic, right?
The Movie Critic.
Oh, The Movie Critic. Okay, that makes more sense.
I believe.
And I've been hearing a lot of discussion about this of like, is this because Brad Pitt has been getting a bunch of bad press, and this was supposed to be like a backdoor sequel to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood because his character Cliff Booth was supposed to be in this movie? There's been a lot of speculation about that. I feel like it's probably just like he was just like, no, this isn't working anymore. I want to do something else. But I don't know. I think putting the limit on the number of films in your filmography before you finished seems like it's unnecessary pressure, but I don't know who am I say.
It feels like it was a cool thing to say when he was like 40 and he had made like, you know, a few movies. And now it's like, now that he's in this trap that he's made for himself, it's like, all right, just let it go. That said, I don't know if the pitch that was made public for this movie was that engaging. Like it seemed a little weird. So it does seem possible that maybe the story didn't work. There's also some talk that it actually wasn't still the movie critic as had been announced, about kind of based on a true life person who wrote movie reviews for like a smutty adult magazine, but had instead actually morphed into a Cliff Booth spin-off movie, or maybe a sort of, it's following 3 or 4 characters and those are just 2 of the characters. And so it's possible that when he says he's not doing the movie critic, what he means is the project evolved into something else, and
Right.
it's, you know, whatever. He also said he wasn't going to do the Hateful Eight because the Hateful Eight script leaked because of Bruce Dern, and so which he knew because he had watermarked everyone's script, and so he knew Bruce Dern accidentally leaked it, or someone who worked for him. And then like a few months later was like, fine, I'm just doing it. So
Okay.
don't believe him. Don't listen to this man.
Who knows what'll happen from here? But it was big news in the movie world. I really want to get into talking about challengers. Let's start with everybody's short take. We'll start with Antonio. What was your general reaction to challengers?
I thought it was a lot of fun. I thought it worked as a tennis movie, a relationship movie, a character study of not particularly deep, but wildly entertaining and relatable characters. I loved its portrayal of athletes and the psychology of sports. Sports movies are often biopics. Um, that's where the interest is often generated from. But those are, of course, constrained by their actual biographies of the reference, like King Richard, for example. So it's nice to have a film that can play with these original characters and can take them into sort of like wild places. So I had a great time. How about you, PT?
I agree that I thought it was really fun. I actually don't know if it was good. Like there were a lot of things where I was like, I don't know if this actually works. But I had a great time on the ride. I agree with what you're saying, Antonio, about how movies are usually these sort of movies are usually biopics, especially when it's an individual sport like tennis, as opposed to a team where you could, maybe it's easier to conceive of a fictional team existing and coming together, but it feels a lot more unique to sort of hang a story on these individuals. And it feels like there's been a trend away from movies kind of just rooted in everybody's horny and wants to hook up with each other, that like that kind of like hypersexual movie is not as prominent. So it was nice to have that element back in the theater and kind of feel that energy in the room while watching it. I think it's definitely worth seeing in a theater to get the group watch experience of it. Even though, again, I don't know if it's actually a particularly good movie, but we can talk about that.
We'll get into it. So my experience in the theater was also really great, which is crazy because there weren't actually that many people in the theater. So because it was yesterday, it was in the middle of the day, and so I wasn't really expecting a big crowd at all. But it was one of those things that, like, by the time the trailers finished, like a good number of people trickled in. So it was probably, if I had to guess, probably like about 20 people in the theater. So it's not no, like very small crowd, but still like enough that I didn't feel like I was watching the movie by myself. And people were hooting and hollering during this entire movie, and it was so fun. And doing the or like like a lot. There was a lot of verbal reactions to what was going on in a way that was super fun. And I wasn't expecting, because I was like, oh, this is like noon on a Monday. There's going to be nobody in the theater. It's going to be super quiet. It's just going to be me contemplating this movie by myself. But no, I ended up still getting the sort of crowd feel, which was really fun. I really enjoyed this movie. I think I'm going to be critically, I'm probably going to be, it sounds like I'm going to be the highest out of all of us. I thought and maybe it was because of my expectations. Like going in, I was like, oh, this is going to be sort of like a trashy, fun time, but maybe not pretty surface level in terms of like, because the way it had been marketed was sort of like that, right? Of like, come for the sexy time, right? Come for big movie stars. And it wasn't really sort of like presenting itself as anything more than that. And I thought there was just enough there to elevate it that I was into it critically as much as in terms of the entertainment value. I think the screenplay, while it's not perfect, It does, and just enough character development that I don't feel like it's just about these characters who want to hook up. There's sort of like enough subtext for me there that I was able to engage with it at a different level. I think as Antonio was saying, as a tennis movie, this is incredible. As a sports movie, this is incredible. Because even actually, you're saying individual versus team sport kind of makes a difference, and that is true, I think. But even a lot of team sport movies are that kind of based on a true story. Like, wasn't it amazing that they pulled together and did this thing, right? And so I was thinking about King Richard a lot during this movie because it's the most kind of the most successful, most recent other tennis movie that we had. And I do agree that having it not be boxed into, because it's clearly influenced by a lot of tennis history, but it's like completely its own thing. And the performances in this are spectacular. Like I was wholly invested in the chemistry between these three characters and actors. And we'll get into like there's been some debate about Zendaya's performance and like how into it people are, or how people are reading it. So I want to talk about that in spoiler mode. But like, I thought she was incredible. It's so nice to see her finally get like a lead performance. And I don't know. I was the score. I'm gonna be talking a lot about the score because it's so good and provides so much energy to the story, and like it's so dynamic, and there's so much like the filmmaking in this has so much swagger, which was so pleasurable to watch, I think. So I had a great time.
I will say I thought I was going to respond to what you were saying, Jen, with my hottest take about the movie, which is that I didn't really care about the characters. Like by the like, I want to wait to get into spoiler to sort of get into more, but like there were multiple times in the back half of the movie when I was actively thinking, I don't care what happens to them. Like I'm disconnected from this.
That's fair.
Like, it's more just like what's going to happen, which is not take away from the performances. I do think the performances are great. And I don't think it's necessarily like a problem with like there's no sort of fault anywhere, tennis term, beyond the fact that like, I don't know, it just didn't like connect that way for me. But I was wrong because I thought we were going to wait to get into spoiler territory, but we can say it now. My actual hottest take is I don't like the score and I don't like the way it's used. I think it's actually a detriment to the movie.
Oh, wow.
And I think we have to get to the spoiler territory. This is clearly a minority opinion because everybody seems to love the score. There were multiple times when the score kicked in and I was like, this is making this a worse movie. This is actually bad.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that. We'll get into it. All right. So recommendation algorithm, right? Because we're still in the spoiler-free zone. So if people haven't seen this film, who do we think is going to be into it, right? Like a couple of my sub questions were, do you need to like tennis to watch this movie? Do you, and like, I really want to kind of in as non-spoilery a way as possible, sort of manage people's expectations. Cause I feel like the marketing of this movie is a little bit of false advertising in terms of like the sexy factor. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too.
Well, I'll start with so I played tennis in high school. I play tennis, like I love tennis. I think liking tennis helps. I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but I will say this because I've talked to some people who also play tennis who watched it, and what we all sort of appreciate were some of the details. Like there was a whole sequence, like it was a short sequence where they focused specifically on footwork. And like when I play with Janine, when I play with my wife, like 90% of the time when she asks like what went wrong with that shot, the answer is footwork, right? Because footwork sets everything up, it gets you in position. And so like that I appreciated. Patrick's weird service motion being a kind of like useless affectation is also sort of like is an interesting and very like understanding tennis kind of thing. One-handed versus two-handed backhands. We'll talk about that in a bit too. I think if you like sports movies, if you like relationship dramas, if you like intense character focus, movies that I started thinking of were like Friday Night Lights, both the movie and the TV show. King Richard for sure. I'm gonna say Naiad, just because it like goes like deep into the just in any opportunity to bring it up. So those would be my
shaking my
that's
head.
my contributions to the algorithms. What do you all think?
I mean, I think Naiad's not a bad comparison, but not
Yeah.
for the
Oh,
reasons
no.
that you think. No, that's unfair. That's unfair. The one thing I'll add, I agree with all of that, and yeah, I think I don't know tennis as well as you do. It's been a long time since I've played, and I only have sort of fitfully watched. I've been following tennis, but it felt very authentic. As someone in that position, it felt very authentic. I thought that was good. The only other, I guess, thing I will put in is people who are very interested in movies about competition and being competitive. Like that was like such a core part here that felt like it, was hinted at, I guess, in these sort of trailers and the marketing for this movie, but was even more at the core. Like very kind of strange when you started listing comparable movies. Like I kind of had like a Glengarry Glen Ross of like people kind of jostling for position and trying to figure out where they are, which is obviously it's a very different movie, a very different context. But so much of the relationships in this movie are about that and about trying to figure out like who am I measuring myself against and how am I what's my level of competition and how successful am I against it.
So
Jen?
my tennis background is my dad has always been obsessed with tennis. It's like one of his favorite things in the whole world. He's quite well, I mean, less so. He also had a knee injury that kind of messed up his amateur tennis, like not career would be too strong a word, but like he played a lot less tennis after that. But he was actually really good and taught people lessons and stuff like that at his local, like very unofficially so, like at his local gym or wherever he used to go. And so I grew up watching a lot of tennis and being forced to play a lot of tennis begrudgingly, kind of because I was pretty terrible at it. But my dad was always very much like if you just work really hard at this, you could be like the next star of X fill in the blank thing, right? So it was like piano, I was going to go to conservatory. Tennis, I was going to become like a professional tennis player. Like everything had a lot of pressure attached to it. So I have a weird relationship with tennis, which I'm very familiar with it. And so I actually agree with what Antonio's saying, where like it's almost like world building for tennis, because I recognize so many things and like so many touchstones of like the culture surrounding tennis and like what players have to do and stuff like that. That it really felt kind of like I was being sucked into this world that I hadn't really had to think about for a long time. So I would say that tennis, being interested in tennis is a plus, but I also feel like if you know nothing about tennis, there's still a very entertaining plot line, and a lot is explained very elegantly about like anything you would need to know about tennis is pretty well explained. I would say that like they maybe overdid it with like because there's a lot of, this is not a spoiler I don't think, but there's a lot of time jumping in the movie, and they kind of like overdid it with the time, like the time stamps, like the 3 years later, 4 years.
Yeah.
I was like, this is a lot. Like I don't know if we needed this every single time we switched timelines. But I would say, like, in terms of explaining tennis as a sport, anything you need to know, the movie does a pretty good job of filling you in. So,
and I think if you are just like, I don't know anything about tennis, or I don't care about it, like everything still works. Like you may not have a full grasp of like, where are we in this match between whenever they're showing a match between two people, you're like, who's winning? And you can tell from the acting and from the way people are responding to it. Whereas if you do know the rules of tennis, like, this person is like up 3 sets, like, got it. I don't know if it's necessary to know tennis. And even if you maybe actively dislike tennis, you can still just let all that wash over you. It's like watching James Bond play Baccarat and just be like, sure, I don't know. That's fine. And I think the movie will work as it works separate from that.
I do feel like the movie captures the sort of paradox of tennis, like socially, in the sense that it's historically supposed to be this very sort of like bougie, civilized, quote unquote, sport, but then also like contemporary tennis. Like, I grew up in the John McEnroe was on his way out, Pete Sampras was on his way in. Like that was the prime era in which I watched tennis. And I just remember being like, why are so many people throwing their rackets on the ground? and getting so angry, right? So it's this interesting dichotomy of like, on the one hand, it's supposed to be, among other sports, is supposed to be this less aggressive, and yet is so aggressive. And I feel like this movie really captured that dynamic really well. Like there's a lot of aggressive tennis playing.
I have a friend who used to work for the U.S. Tennis Association, and they would spill tea about some of the professional tennis players. I'm not going to name like the players that they were talking about, but they mentioned one in particular, someone who'd risen really quickly through the ranks, and as a teenager, like became like a star really quickly. And they were talking about how like even as an adult, she grew into like her 20s, late 20s, still acted like a child, right? And largely this was because just like this was just her entire life, and everyone catering to her and like that. So yeah, I think that you're right, that there's the reputation of it as sort of like a country club sport, but often the people who excel, they excel because they've had such a singular focus on the sport since childhood. But that also stunts development in other areas.
So the other question, I feel like this movie's marketing is really leaning into the threesome element, right? That's the clip that we keep seeing in the trailers.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's really trying to play up the like, don't you want to see what happens next salaciousness factor. And I feel like this movie does have a lot of sexual tension in it, but what sort of surprised me is like, it's not like Poor Things. Like there's no actual sex scenes, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Like it's not graphic in the way that something like Poor Things is. And so it's interesting because I feel like I don't think anyone's going to be mad about that necessarily, but I do think I want to, because I feel like there might be some people who are like, oh, this movie's too sexy for me. I don't want to go see it in the theater. Right. Like, and it's not in that, the representation of sex in it is not graphic to the point where it would make half of the people watching it uncomfortable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think some people will be mad.
Okay.
But yeah, I agree that it was marketed a certain way. I had certain expectations about it, especially that scene in particular. And it was more restrained than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I think my follow up to what Antonio said would have to be in the spoiler section. So
Spoiler,
I don't
yeah.
say it,
I hesitate to even ask this question.
But I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing for the plot of the movie and for responding to it to go in thinking it's going to be more graphic sexually than it is. But that doesn't mean that people won't be disappointed if they were like, it's kind of, I mean, again, a weird movie to compare it to, but it feels a little bit like the Eyes Wide Shut thing where people were like, we're going to watch Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman just have sex for like a half hour in this movie. And then it was like, no, actually it's this weird like drama of this man's internal conflict and wrestling with, his wife's desires. And people were like, no, I don't want that. And so I think that similarly, this movie is interested in other things and is using that as sort of a jumping off point. There may be audience members who don't like it, not according to Letterboxd, where everybody is just like hooting and hollering over this. And which again, I think this movie is benefiting from the fact that so many, I mean, not that this is like a blockbuster, it's been successful so far, but so many prominent movies are kind of 4-quadrant sexless things that like don't, there's like people kissing, but that's kind of it. So the fact that it even hints at anything more than that is maybe enough for some audience members. But yeah, the sophisticated long take review listeners who maybe expect a little more graphic sex in their movies will potentially be let down. It may be good for them to know, but it also might not be a bad thing for them to go in thinking it's going to go one way and it actually goes another, because that tracks for the movie.
Yeah, and I guess we're really getting close to spoiler mode here, but what I would say too is like, I think all of the tension that's in the relationship scenes gets actually played out on the tennis court. And that's actually what I really liked about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I thought that was pretty clever, might not be the right word, but I liked that was the thing, is that like that the relationship drama and the tennis part were so fused together and inseparable that one kind of fed into the other. And that was a lot of the enjoyment I derived from this movie, I think, was from that. But yeah, so it sounds like we're gonna go into spoiler mode. I guess the last thing I will shout out to is Greg told us not to use him as a straw man argument on this and invoke his cooler review of this movie. But so I'm not going to do that because we promised him we wouldn't do that. But he did warn us that there was some like motion sickness potentially in the movie, and I will just say that like I did not get motion sick, but I totally knew what he was talking about because the editing I feel like is very good in this movie, but there are a few choices that either to me felt like they came from an old video game, where it's because it's like it's sort of like a first person perspective, and there's like an arm sticking out, and you're like, where am I? But yeah, I would just say that there's
that also matches the CGI tennis balls that are bouncing around, so that does track.
All right, so we're gonna go into spoiler mode. If you have not seen Challengers and you do not want it spoiled, go see the movie. It's a lot of fun. As we said, you can come back and rejoin us for the rest of the conversation. All right, so I'm going to go straight to the ending to get us started because I do think that's the most sort of spoilery part about this is how it ends. My big question is, did sort of like it's a very literal like what happened because I do think it's pretty ambiguous. So what do you just general what do you think happened at the end? And specifically, I guess the good way to get us kicking off on this ending conversation is, do you think Patrick actually tried to throw the game or like had decided that he was going to do that? Because they very purposely leave that ambiguous when Tashi and Patrick part ways, right? She has asked him to lose on purpose. But do you think he actually was doing that?
I think he was, and then I feel bad because I've already forgotten the characters' names. Sorry.
Art is Mike Feist.
Yeah, Art and Patrick. Okay. I think Patrick was trying to throw the game. And then once Art kind of realized that or Art realized that, he had done the signal that like he had hooked up again with Tashi, then Art was sort of like, well, I'm not going to play then. And so I feel like when they were like, they did that last volley was them sort of being like, we're going to try again for real. So I think they were actually trying there at the end. I have to assume that Patrick won because Art, that's a fault, like jumping over the net. Like there's that has to count.
Like that wouldn't have counted.
Yeah. But I think it is like, it's left intentionally vague that like they both won because they hugged at the end.
The ending is very silly, right? So you mentioned the motion stuff, right? Like the violent whatever. When we had those shots, and those shots prepared me for a much more violent end to the movie, because at that moment when I thought he was going to like hit him. I thought he was going to hurt.
Yeah.
I thought that was portending like a Walking Dead Negan like scene, and I was not. I was hoping that was not the way that was going to go, because while I understand that PT didn't really like the characters and didn't have a stake, maybe perhaps in like who wins in the relationship, because it seems like all of them sort of lose kind of on the relationship end of things, perhaps. I still liked I liked all three of them. So I didn't want it to be an awful like violent end. But I also think I didn't love the hug, which was so, but when we were walking out of the movie, PT and I watched it together, and then we were walking out. We were trying very carefully not to like spoil what we were going to talk about today. But a question I couldn't help ask myself was like, well, what did I want to happen, right? Because in the nature of a game, someone has to win, and I didn't really feel like it would have been a superior movie for either of them to win, but it still makes sense for someone to win. I don't think it was actually match point at the time that that thing happened. I'm not sure if it was. Maybe it was, but it's true that it would have been that its point goes to the person. You can't go across the net. But I think that the main sort of like thematic takeaway is that it doesn't matter who wins the match, which I guess is thematically right, but in the drama of the moment was just kind of like, well, this is kind of not great. It's like
so
not this is
you
kind of
interpreted that as like a sports movie failure, that it refused to be like who won.
yeah, exactly, right.
Mhm,
That
mhm.
I think that in sports, someone has to win, someone has to lose, and there are consequences to that. Um, but again, like thinking through this from a screenplay perspective in terms of like the character arcs, I'm not sure that either one winning is any more satisfying than the other. Um, and I think that I had also sort of like stopped caring about who wins the relationship, that like who wins Tashi at the end of this, right? Like that was no longer like a thing I cared about by the end of the movie. And I think that's intentional, right? So so I think that I still really liked the movie. I don't like the ending, but I can't think of a better ending. So Jen, what do you think?
So I agree with your descriptor that it's a little bit silly, but honestly, in the moment, I did not care at all. I really loved it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like the screenplay does a pretty good job of setting up Tashi's stake in all of this is purely the tennis, right? Like really the only thing she cares about is this love of the game that seems so pure. And because she says in the very early scene where they first meet her and they're like hanging out on the beach, she says something like, because she's talking about the match that she had earlier that day where she like completely decimated her opponent.
Yeah.
And she says for about 15 seconds we were actually playing tennis, right? And so there's some kind of like sublime ideal of a tennis match that she has in her mind. And that's where the whole that's where the whole metaphor of like tennis is a relationship, right? This movie's about relationships. And so she has this very kind of like idyllic sense of like, I just care about good tennis, like from an like artistic perspective. Like I want to feel that feeling of like getting lost in the match and it's only about the two people
Yeah.
playing or whatever, right? So I feel like because that's seated really early on, by the time we get to the ending,
Mhm.
and there's so many great like echoes, right? Because you can tell, because and I feel like that's this movie's greatest strength, is planting these little behavioral seeds that then like get repeated later, and then and they don't have to say anything to each other, what's going on, right? So obviously plot wise, the biggest version of that is the like the tell, right, of the like
Mhm.
the he puts the ball in the Patrick puts the ball in the neck of the tennis racket, and then he doesn't have to say anything, and Art knows that Tashi has cheated on him with Patrick, right? And that's what sort of like creates this whole snowball of what happens. But I feel like her standing up, Tashi standing up and being like, "Come on!" and right, that reaction, because we saw her do it earlier in the movie, we know that's her reaction to like, I am seeing pure tennis, right? Like,
Mhm.
and so I feel like, and like up until that point, she's basically not watching the match. You know what I mean? I feel like her body language is very telling in terms of like how she's engaged with like the stakes of what's going on. And so to me, them like colliding into each other and hugging each other was the perfect sort of like culmination of both, she's happy because they are finally actually playing tennis with each other, right? They have achieved this sort of ideal that she has in her head, because they're actually like both fired up, and they like, and I feel like the editing really supports that idea, right? Because it's like
Mhm.
it sort of shows how they're really like straining to get like to catch every shot, whereas maybe they wouldn't have before. But then for them, right, this was all about the competition over Tashi was what ruined their relationship, and now they've sort of reached some kind of reconciliation where they've sort of forgotten about all that, and they're just back to this like playing tennis again. And like and also tied up in that is like art's like, he's lost his mojo, kind of, right? He's lost his confidence, but this is what lights that fire to him
Mm.
again. And so even if the point didn't count, him just like really like the shot of him like flying through the air and going towards the net I was like, this is incredible. I love this. Like, so yeah. So maybe it's a little silly, but I feel like in the moment and in the context of what the film had built up until that point,
Sure.
I thought it was satisfying.
In terms of the tennis as a metaphor, one thing that I really appreciated about it is that like tennis is a sport where often you're playing against the same people over and over again because you have to arrange a particular time and like there are only so many people who can play and that you want to play with someone at your level, right? And so you get to know so when she first at the beginning talked about tennis as a metaphor for a relationship, I was like, what? But I feel like the movie did a really nice job of like following through with what that meant. And as I thought about it more, I was like, it does make sense, right? Because typically one person is a little bit better, right? But the only way you get better in tennis is playing against someone who's better. Often what happens when you're playing with someone for a long period of time is that the person who's a little bit worse is getting a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better, and then one day sometimes something flips, right, and they win. And often when that happens, they don't cede supremacy. Like you did it, like you've won, and now you figured out how to win, and now it's
Mm.
going to take a lot for you to like stop winning, right? Because you figured something out in the course of their game and your game, right? And so what I liked about this movie is how it constantly plays with this idea of who has the upper hand and how that shifts throughout the progression of the film, right? So I think that it used its metaphor really effectively and and numerous times I felt like, right, that most of the conversations are just two people sort of like arguing in kind of a playful way, and the sort of back and forth sort of mimics like a tennis match. So it was a lot of fun. To get to the point about the ending, it was so much fun in watching the back and forth that it seemed a shame that someone should have to be the winner, right? And so on the one hand, like again, I even though the actual image on screen as a tennis player, I'm like, oh, but it still makes sense. Though I think to end the film in that way, and probably is the most emotionally satisfying way for it to go. Because I definitely think that a violent end or whatever, what I was stealing myself for, I definitely wouldn't have wanted to see. PT, what do you think?
Well, I first want to make it clear that despite having moments where I was like, it wasn't that I did dislike the characters or wanted one of them to be beaten with a racket. I was not rooting for violence. It was more that as we sort of moved through the sort of second part of Act 2 and the beginning of Act 3, when it became more like, and there was this betrayal and there's this like I was like, it was all getting very silly in a way that the ending actually kind of brought me back of like, oh, this was all sort of supposed to be silly. Okay.
Yeah.
Like that's fine. And I like everything that Jen, you were saying about like that sort of payoff of it being sort of tennis being real. And at least for Zendaya's character, Tashi, I feel
Tashi.
bad. I don't remember. These names did not stick with me at all. But that Tashi, like that's real life to her, is like pure tennis is what is kind of all that matters. And so like for her, it just meshes where like if something good happens or something really pure occurs, that's tennis. Even if it's not, it's actually like maybe that's just like a friendship rekindling or falling in love with someone. So yeah, I mean, it all again, it all was sort of goofy, and so I like that it got goofy there. At the end, I do have a question for my the two of you who are more knowledgeable about tennis. Men's tennis matches are best of five, right? Best of
It
five sets.
depends. It depends on the tournament. If you're
Okay.
playing at like a grand slam, it's a best 3 out of 5 sets. But often and I imagine at a challenger event, it would probably be a 2 out of 3 sets.
Okay. Because there was a part of me that was like, there's still another, they still have to play more, right? But they did say match point at one point. I
Yeah.
don't know if I don't recall if that final volley was for match point, and also like I don't believe there's a scenario where it's like winner takes all. It's always someone has advantage, someone could
Right.
win.
Mhm.
A tiebreaker. They were at a tiebreaker. You have to win by 2 points in a tiebreaker. Otherwise,
Right.
it could just go forever. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, the ending that I thought was going to happen when Antonio did ask, and it was of course lovely to watch the movie with Antonio. But what Antonio asked, and I saved it for the content. Greg would be proud. I hope that's on a straw man, Greg. That where he was like, what did you think was going to happen at the end? The idea that I had, I thought was like, in my mind, was very clear what was going to happen. Was that we were not, the volley was just, we're gonna cut to black in the middle of that volley, and we were never going to know what happened. It was always going to be about the two of them bouncing back and forth, and Tashi in the middle, just sort of like watching. So again, I actually kind of like that it ended on a like reconnection moment that was very unrealistic compared to everything else that had happened around the tennis match, because it's again, it feels like such a backhanded compliment to say that like, oh, it excused how goofy things got in terms of like, and they cheated then and they cheated this other time and they connected here and they fought here, but it made all of that feel like, oh, okay, this was not meant to be that serious in terms of how they were interacting and what the push pull was between the three of them.
So I just wanted to end like our conversation about the ending with what Luca Guadagnino had to say, because I found an interview with him in Entertainment Weekly. And again, like, you know, this is with the caveat of like, just because the director says this is what they think is happening at the end of their movie does not mean that's actually what's happening at the end of their movie, right? We have to take that with a grain of salt, but it's just another data point, kind of like to help with the interpretation of it potentially. So he confirmed that the ending brings everything full circle to the trio's pivotal hotel room makeout, right? So that scene that's in the trailers. Quote, they are acting out for 13 years the possibility of going back to that hotel room to find again the beautiful moment of burgeoning desires and innocence, Guadagnino says. And at the same time, to feel at ease with one another the way they were there. So throughout the entire arc, that's what they're trying to do. And finally, the rivalry at that heightened level, the triangle finally found itself sitting in the same place, but now on the court. So that's why he's like, and then Guadagnino goes on to say in this interview that like he purposely doesn't want it to matter whether who wins or like if anyone's winning. It's just about this one sort of moment in time where if like for a brief moment, they have kind of returned to the dynamic that originally started all of this.
I think that works. Now that we've brought them sort of together in the ending, I want to talk about them a little bit separately now. And one thing that I liked was that how they play tennis sort of matched qualities, like it pretended qualities about their character, right? And I was trying to think about which tennis players, like professional tennis players, I would track with each one. So Patrick seemed like he had a lot of raw power, but was also a bit of a jokester, right? I mentioned his like weird service motion. He also doesn't seem to take himself that seriously.
You mean like when he puts, just to clarify for listeners who don't know tennis, like you mean when he puts his racket behind his head before he serves, like the weird waving thing?
He rocks the racket behind his head before, and that, I mean, there's nothing that doesn't do anything, right? Like for service motion, right? Like there are certain things that you do, there are certain stances that you that generate power, that generate spin, but the motion that's behind the head, that's not doing anything, right? Like that's just a work of your wrist before the service motion, so it doesn't function as anything except it's sort of like his trademark, which seems kind of like right for like this character who kind of like, you know, like if he were like a star, then it would be cool. But since he's playing in a challenger and his career didn't really sort of take off, it seems kind of pathetic that this sort of like whatever, right? That so the player that I tracked him to was like Nick Kyrgios. He's someone who like famously has a lot of tantrums on the court, very emotional on the court, and he's had more success recently. But commentators often talk about how like, well, if he just got his act together, like he could be one of the best players in the world. Art, very early in the movie, Tashi says like, well, even though Patrick keeps beating Art, right, in that dynamic, right, that in their younger days, Patrick is the superior player. But Tashi says like, well, you could beat him. You should beat him, right? And so what she's recognizing is, one, there's something in like mentally in your game that's stopping you, right? There's a block. But two, you have more skill, right? Like there's more there. She recognizes that there's just sort of like more talent there. There's more versatility to his game. And and so Patrick has the two-handed backhand, which is more powerful because you can generate it with like, you know, both arms. Art has a one-handed backhand, right? Which is a little bit going out of fashion now, but like Roger Federer had like a beautiful one-handed backhand, and is an example of like a player who when people talk about the artistry of tennis, he's often sort of the pinnacle of it, right? There was something almost like balletic about the way that Roger Federer played. Art, I don't know that his work, his like watching him is like Federer like, but I think that he's the closest to that. Like that he's sort of he has what I think is intended to be the more aesthetically pleasing game. But he's psychologically fragile. So him, I sort of harken back to like Andy Murray a little bit, like a very talented player who still won things, but there were some psychological blocks to him, and like his psychology was very evident on the court and was very much talked about, especially in England. And then Tashi, I mean, I think that they there's been a lot in the news about like the Williams sisters and what the Williams sisters thought of her, and and the way like part of there was a block for me in that Zendaya is so like thin, right? Like she's not really built like an athlete, but I think that the way that the film frames her and the way that she just like her body movement throughout it, I believed her like as soon as she was on the court, right? Um, um, like given her frame, like the way that she looked, it didn't seem like she's playing like a power game, and the way that she is hitting her shots, it seems very much like a power game, even though she looks more like a Martina Hingis, for example, someone who's a little more like agile and versatile and clever on the court. And her character is actually pretty clever, but like on the court, it's just this sort of singular like focus. And so it reminded me of the Williams sisters. She's also like beautiful, right? And that reminded me of sort of like Anna Kournikova, like the days when people talked about how like we're talking just about how she looked and not so much about her tennis, and that was a struggle for her in her career, right? So so anyway, I really liked how they used the tennis to signal things about who they were, and how that ultimately plays out in the course of their relationship.
I love it. I hadn't really thought about it at that level, but I think it works. And I think the Anna Kournikova comp, I feel like, is also supported by all that one ad that we keep seeing for the Game Changers ad, right? And obviously, like, her editing of the ad from Game Changer to Game Changers is supposed to say a lot about their relationship, right? That she's like, no, it's the two of us and not just you.
Yeah.
And that's why Art at the end is like, I know I'm playing for both of us when I play, right? Because she got injured and she couldn't play anymore. But I do feel like the idea, like, and maybe this is not super realistic, but it does feel like their celebrity is in part because of her sort of like cachet as like a beautiful person and like very stylish and like, you know, and it's interesting. There's a lot of marketing talk throughout the whole movie in terms of like, even Patrick early on is like, when she says, no, I want to stay at the college level and not go pro because, you know, I want to get an education, you know, college has classes. Like, I don't want the only thing that I'm known for is like hitting a ball with a racket. And he's like, his response is like, that's brilliant because I can see the Adidas campaign now, right? Of like, she wants to go to school. Like he's thinking of it purely from like an opportunistic kind of mindset. And so I feel like it's interesting. There's a lot of that sort of subtly sprinkled throughout the movie. We really cut to that ad, that billboard with the two of them a lot.
Yeah.
So it's clearly something the movie wants us to be thinking about as well.
Yeah.
Feels like it goes from approval process to being a billboard very fast. Like it's all within like 2 weeks.
That's true.
Which all due respect and credit to the billboard company for getting it up so quickly. I love that breakdown, Antonio. At least one of those players I'd never heard of. So that was you're in deep, and always happy when there's a sports take review segment on the show, and I think that was really useful here to see the parallels. I also had thought about Anna Kournikova and the Maria Sharapova, who always felt like the more successful Anna
Sure.
Kournikova. That like, but there was this, this hypersexualization. Was I the only one surprised that the Tashi got injured while still in college? Like going into the movie, I was like, oh, she's a superstar. Like she's like on the cusp of winning like a Grand Slam, and would have already been a professional. That was my assumption. And again, maybe that's just reacting to the trailers and thinking I know the story. But
Right.
it was interesting in that, like, and this is not a critique, but if it does seem very plausible that someone who had such a good story and was so young and was so attractive would have been famous even without having ever really been pro, only done like a youth tournaments and then a little bit of college. But it was interesting that like it felt like even more so than I guess I had assumed going in that it was going to be like, oh, the former fallen star with her husband, who's the current star, that it feels even more just sort of like most people in the tennis world would be like, who is this person? Like what? And it's just like the attractive woman who is the coach of the person who is an Andy Roddick or whoever, like someone who is a prominent tennis player, not the best tennis player in the world, but like in that top 5 conversation. That it put her in a lower power position to go back to Antonio's sort of who has the supremacy in a head-to-head match. She was always kind of lower ranked, as it were, than I expected going into the movie. That's all. That's something I didn't think was going to happen, and I think that's an interesting.
I feel like that makes her. I feel like that makes her story all the more tragic, but also like from a character is like more useful. I agree that it's kind of more unrealistic, but it is more useful from a character motivation perspective, right? Because she was like, her career was cut short before it even really had started. And that because of that, everything for her went into becoming a coach and coaching art in particular. And I feel like the moment right before the fights that are happening right before she gets injured, again, sets it up really well because she is trying to coach Patrick and he's just like, I don't want any of this. Like, you're my peer. I'm not your student. But she very clearly is like, well, shouldn't we do whatever it takes so that you can be the best that you can be? And he's just like, no, I'm not interested in that at all. And because and she ends up marrying Art because he is like more than receptive to being coached by her. Right. But it's for the wrong reasons. Right. And that, again, that's why that final scene for me is so exciting, because each of the 3 of them have entirely and conflicting investment in the relationships that they have with each other, because Tashi just wants someone a player she can coach. Right. That's why she ends up choosing Art. He is willing to be coached by her because he loves her so much, right? And is like basically like, I will do anything for you, right? And so like even to the point where he's like, I'm doing this because I don't want, like, I'm doing this even though I don't want to anymore, right? Which they make pretty clear towards the end of the movie. Sure. And so it's like they're kind of at like they're and in an interview that I was watching yesterday with the 3 of them as a part of like their premiere press tour, Zendaya described it as 3-way codependency, where it's like each of them needs something else from the other, but can't completely get what they want, right? Like, or you know what I mean? Like that they depend on each other, but it's never quite lines up to a whole relationship, which I thought was like made the relationship drama part of the movie made a lot more sense to me. I was like, oh yeah, like you're right. Like that's what the problem, and that's both why their relationship works at like a pure chemistry level, but then also why it can't work as like an actual relationship.
Right. And I think that ties into, I think that ties into the competitive aspect where like it's all a competition for Tasha. It's all trying to like find the angle, find the advantage to see who's going to win. And, setting up even like who, it's has to be whoever wins the match between the 2 of them is who she will agree to date. And that I actually feel she's always trying to do that and sort of approaches every part of her life in that
right.
winning sense.
I actually feel like there's an interpretation of the ending where she's orchestrating all of this, where she purposely, I don't know if this is true, but I feel like you could potentially, with the ambiguity, there's room to argue that she goes to Patrick specifically to set off like the rivalry that she knows will, you know what I mean? That she knows will fire Art up, because there's an earlier line when they're the churro, the like very intimate churro eating. I don't know if you remember this. In the dining hall.
Yes.
Great scene. The best churro eating I've seen in a movie in a long time. But basically Patrick actually isn't mad at Art for like trying to like break them up, because he's like, it's just so exciting to see you fired up about something. And I feel like that's the dynamic that's at play in the final scene too, right? Where it's like, and so that's, I feel like the best reading of Tashi as a character, for me at least, is the more sort of machinations she has because she wants to achieve this like platonic ideal of tennis. That she's like, and it also makes her the most cruel because, and like least caring, because she's willing to like play them off each other to the point to get them right. But I feel like that's in keeping with the character that they've set up for her, that because she cares only about the tennis, that she's willing to do all these like other morally or sort of like, you know, empathetically questionable decisions.
To go to the sort of the beauty of tennis and tennis players appreciating game, even when you have two like incredible rivals who just really want to win the match, right? When there's like a great shot in tennis, right? Like just an amazingly beautiful shot. There's a typical gesture where a player takes their racket and they clap with their hand, right? Um, and also in terms of like weird sort of courtesies of tennis, if you clip the net and it goes over and you win the point, but it was clearly just like a sort of like freakish like accident, you hold out your hand as if to say I'm sorry, right? And these are just some of the weird sort of courtesies of tennis, but again, it's sort of like I appreciate what you've done, right? Like you're winning, right? Like that you won that point, but I respect it, right? Or that I won that point, but I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry that that's the way that I had to win it, right? So again, it tracks with the tennis, right? This moment that seems sort of surprising in the relationship context, because normally you're prepared for someone to get pissed off and they'd be really mad about it, but then just sort of like, all right, we're playing a game and I recognize that move, right? And good for you, for trying that drop shot, right? So I like that. Now I wanted to go back to PT's point about like Tashi not being as big a star, because I agree that I was sort of led to believe that that's what would have happened, and that would have changed the emotional stakes perhaps a bit, if she were in fact had been a bigger star. But I think the answer for me is actually more sort of prosaic, which is that it's already a complicated like timeline, and it takes time for her to develop into like a major player, and it would have introduced like even more complications with time for that to have been the case. So I think that's why that part is sort of short circuited and moved into that time, right? I think that's the
that
like
makes
functional
sense.
reason. Yeah.
How I have two sort of big questions, and I'll ask the first one based on that. How did you all feel about the timeline presentation and the sort of jumping around?
It tracks tennis a little bit, right? The back and forth.
Like a ping pong, yeah.
Yeah, like ping pong. But I agree also that it was a little much at times, and I don't know that I would do without the label signals, because I think that actually was kind of helpful. um, but I don't know that it needed to move as often as it did. I don't know. What do you think, Jen?
I didn't mind it, and I liked that I liked this overall structure. I do feel like individual transitions, maybe especially towards the end, they seem to ramp up, which probably was purposeful to be like, oh, the match is getting, the ping ponging is getting more intense or whatever. So I do feel like it did sort of like push, it got oversaturated towards the end for me a little bit. as did the camera work, because like the first time the ball's zooming at my face, I'm like, cool, that's cool. I've never seen that. Right. But then like when we started doing the like swerving and the like the things that Greg sort of warned us about that might cause motion sickness, then I was like, well, is this just like shooting this differently for the sake of it? Like, you know what I mean? Like I sort of started to question it as a choice a little bit, especially with the first person POV stuff. But in terms of the structure, I actually really liked the idea that and I didn't expect this based on the trailer necessarily. I really liked that we start with the end. Like I liked that just general that structure of like the main timeline is the match that's happening at the end of the movie that gets resolved at the end of the movie, or not resolved depending on your opinion. And that we cut back and sort of like the past sort of fills in contextually the present. And so I like that general structure. I think not every moment of execution of it was necessarily great. And I think actually for me, the time markers sort of were more distracting. I think I was fine. Like I didn't need to know it was like 3 days before. I understood it was before. You know what I mean? Like, so I like, to me, and I learned a new word today listening to IndieWire Screen Talk talking about this movie. Ryan Latanzia used the word chiron, which I was like, wait, you mean like the Greek?
Yeah.
And he's like, and I looked it up, and no, there's another spelling of the word CHYRON, which refers to text mapped onto a screen,
like the breaking news thing on the bottom of CNN. Yeah, as the chiron.
So apparently, time stamps like the ones in this movie count as that. Which I was like, oh wow, learned a new word. Great.
Yeah, I didn't mind. There was a while when I was kind of pushing back on just sort of like, why are we like the 3 weeks earlier and then like 13 years earlier? It was like, okay. But I do think it's like once it all sort of wrapped up, I was like, I think my issue with it was that it felt almost condescending to always have those chirons, where it was like, but you established their haircuts, and like the actors did such a good job of embodying the different ages, that I was like, why can't you just trust me that I will know that we're back when they're in college or they're just out of college? And maybe it's because there's not that much difference between like amateur tournament trio, college age trio, and then beginning of the professional career trio. But yeah, I think ultimately I had to realize that I was pushing back on sort of that. Just almost felt like a studio note of like, they don't know what's happening. Like, give them the date, like give them a timestamp of when these are happening.
It's too confusing.
And yeah, I couldn't follow it. I'm in an office. But I do think that structure worked, and I like that it was all based on that. The match, like the match is the present, and that's the story, and the arc of that is what is really unfolding, and everything else is just giving the meaning and context to what's happening there. My other big question, it seemed to be the debate that I was finding just sort of poking around reviews, and is, I guess, somewhat rooted in the concern that I had, that I believe was said on mic multiple times, and I know said also off mic, which is because this movie was going to come out, I think in November or early December, and then got moved to April. There was an arc of time when the trailer was played a lot in movies that I saw in the fall, and then it came back, and it was basically the same trailer for this release. And I was like, okay, I've seen this trailer like close to 20 times, I think. Like, I've seen this trailer a lot of times. Do I know everything that's going to happen in this movie? And thankfully, no, like that is not the case. But I think that as we were kind of wrestling with in the pre-spoiler section about like, basically, are people being misinformed or is it misadvertising about it? I feel like one of the things that I assumed was going to be very prominent and text, if not like super text, is that these two guys are in a sexual relationship with each other, or they had a sexual, full on sexual experience. And that's going to be either something they're wrestling with, or it's a full on love triangle of what we're going to do. And that doesn't really happen to the point of what we were saying earlier of, it isn't that explicit in terms of what happens, which isn't just they don't show us that much, but there isn't really any, beyond that sort of making out on the bed moment. There isn't really anything there. There's a lot of hinting, as I said to Antonio afterwards, a lot of phallic objects being held close to Patrick's mouth during the course of their scenes together. But I've seen some people be like, ooh, like the sort of sexual and particularly bisexual energy of this is like interesting and engaging and challenging. And I've seen other people be like, this was a cop out. Like this was like promised us a love triangle that would really delve into this, and instead just kind of like skirts around the edges and then is ultimately heteronormative. What do you all think about that?
My answer to this question is in Rhetorical Situation. So maybe that's the signal.
Let's do it.
We should dip into the Rhetorical Situation. Okay, the Rhetorical Situation, a segment in which we look at a film through the lens of our academic experience. All four other co-hosts are writing professors. We'd like to have this section of the episode dedicated to making connections to our experience as scholars and teachers in the teaching of writing. The Rhetorical Situation refers to any contextual factors that influence composing and interpretation. So to answer PT's question about this, I immediately thought of, and it's been a long time since I've read anything about this, so if it's really dated, my apologies. But when I was in an undergraduate literature course, there was a grad student who was giving like a guest lecture, and it was about male homosocial desire. And like the main takeaway from this lecture that I sat through was that oftentimes homoeroticism and homosociality become confused or conflated. And so she spent a long time, because it's a bunch of like college freshmen or whatever, like she spent a long time trying to explain the difference between the two, and that homosocial refers to gender segregated situations in our society where and it was mostly focused on men, because I think that we were reading like a Henry James novel or something like that week or something. Like it was really focused on like locker rooms. This is where I'm going with this movie. Like that kind of thing of like male only activities are sort of like have a level of intimacy that is sort of like fertile ground for homoeroticism, right? Which is like actual sexual desire between men. So like this to me was a very interesting lens through which to view this movie, because I do feel like the movie, especially in the ending, is sort of saying that Patrick and Art are actually supposed to be together, right? That this all along, this has been their repressed desire for each other, right? And especially if we think of a film like Call Me by Your Name as like, as sort of filmography context through which to look. I think that supports that idea, right? And also that story in the opening scene where they talk about like when they were 12 in a boarding school dorm room, again, a boarding school, another homosocial environment. Mm-hmm. Right. And to me, it seemed like there was a lot. For me, it was text. For I assume the average viewer of this movie probably subtext, if not just like they're totally missing it. But I just feel like, and there's so many the sort of graphic nudity in this movie is not between these three characters. It's it's in the locker room with all these men being like very close to each other, right? Like and so to me, that like picking up on that sort of, to answer your question, was enough to fuel my reading of the situation as like they are that Art and Patrick are actually attracted to each other, but they're sort of projecting that desire onto Tashi, and that's what creates the problem potentially.
That's interesting. And you mentioned Call Me by Your Name. James Ivory, who won the Oscar, right, for adapted screenplay, sort of famously was not pleased with certain choices in the film, and in particular in that that in the moments, like there weren't really explicit sex scenes between Timothy Chalamet and Armie Hammer. That at the moment when the two of them have sex for the first time, it cuts to the window, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he viewed that as a kind of cop out, right? Um, so I wasn't quite sure what to expect here in this situation. I like Jen's reading of it. My question is, because you had this moment where the two of them at the end of the movie are in this embrace, but you also cut to Tashi, who has this weird smile on her face, right?
Right.
And so um the question is like what drives that smile, right? And is it that she believes that those two men should be together? Is it that she believes that the three of them should be together and that this was the way to achieve whatever balance or whatever? So I'm not quite sure what to do with that moment or with that character. And we sort of skipped over a question about like her and like her what her role in this is and how intentional she is about orchestrating all of this, that I think is also kind of important to this question. What do you think, PT?
I liked Jen's, in terms of what you were just saying about the end of the movie. I really liked Jen's interpretation. I will admit to not having fully grasped that, because I in the moment when I believe it's the closing shot of the movie is her saying like having that smile but then yelling like come on, that it was reflective of that great, when she like had a great volley in the youth tournament, in the first time we see her play. But then there also, I feel like, was a part of me where she was just like, come on, like I can't believe that, like, whatever happened is, their reconnection is superseding the tennis, which is her top priority. And I do think that's maybe open for interpretation, but I like what Jen was saying about how what she was seeing was the purity, was that moment, was that sort of zone of falling into, like, we were playing real tennis, and that all of this has been these two men like finally finding their space again, or maybe even for the first time, together in that moment. And the fact that it's again, I'm less a tennis head than I think the two of you, but my favorite parts of any match is when it's the volley, they get really close to the net and they're like pop, 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 like going back and forth. Always love that. And that of course makes sense that they're just getting closer and closer in that exchange, and that's when it's getting true. And so I do think, in terms of what her role is that I buy the interpretation that it's just an admirer of seeing this perfection, or seeing this platonic ideal finally play out, which could be read as these two guys, one of them sort of, I don't want to say openly bisexual, but there's evidence that Patrick is bisexual outside of just this relationship. There's no evidence that Art has any interest in any man besides Patrick. But that it's like, oh, this is them sort of finding each other. It is left intentionally vague, I think, or at least like not, it's not explicit. It may be textual, but not explicit, if that's a distinction that is worth making, which I think is fine. But I do understand there may be people who, especially in the context of Call Me By Your Name, which maybe didn't have explicit sex scenes, but was very obviously open of, the homosexuality of the characters,
right?
That it's just kind of like, well, what are we left with? Like, maybe they're just like really happy bros who love sharing churros and hug at the end of tennis matches, like, just bros being bros. What are you going to do? That, some people could be disappointed that this might have had that more direct representation. I don't think it's a flaw in the movie, but it did seem like something worth discussing.
I have one technical complaint about the tennis, that PT, but you brought up the scene where they were doing the volleys, and it seemed like there were a lot of volleys.
Yes,
when you approach the net, you're going to end the point, right? Because just like logistically, it's very difficult to keep a rally of volleys going. And I felt like this was the one moment where I was like, that's not how this point could even go, right? Like the angle totally
was for the metaphor, not for the tennis.
Yeah, exactly.
That had me wondering, that because it was going on for so long, I was like, one or both of them is trying to let the other one win. Like they're hitting it to each other because of the situation they've been put into. And it's like, no, take it. No, you take it. No, you take it. And then they're not doing it. Like they're not taking the opportunity. In almost a, they're both trying to foil Tashi's machinations. But again, that seems like it requires coming in with knowledge of how tennis works. And so that would be probably too subtle if that was the intention of the filmmaking. But yeah, that was in the moment. I was like, again, also with the mindset that I was thinking, this is going to end with them just volleying forever. I was like, yes, this is, of course, like neither of them's making the move to close this out.
Can we move to a question? I'd like to move to a question that that you had earlier before the rhetorical situation, because it's a question that that I asked PT on the train, and then I asked, like, well, what do you think Jen's answer would be? What do you think Greg's answer would be? And it was which character was your favorite, and which character were you sort of rooting for, right? And so we all had guesses for all of you, right? So Jen, I think we both agreed for you. And so who is your favorite character?
I mean, I think Tashi's my favorite character.
Oh.
But I sympathize with Art the most.
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't know if that was what your prediction was. Because I can see you thinking about that.
Yeah.
I had said it would be Zendaya because you like Zendaya.
Yeah, so like she's my favorite character because and this entirely hinges on my interpretation of the movie, I think. And what I'm realizing now is so much of my enjoyment is hinging on my specific interpretation of the movie. But I feel like I really identified with her. She's just trying to be good at what she does. Like, can't we just let her be? Like, everyone's got all this other baggage that they're bringing to the table. She just wants everyone to be their best. Like, and is that so much to ask for? That's sort of my response. I would not have made a lot of the choices that she made in this movie, obviously. But I really like her sort of motivations and her ethos. I feel like I identified with the most. And also just the attitude of like, you privileged like white guys.
Mm-hmm.
What is like and you had it so, and like one of my complaints about this movie, and I've heard this from other critics as well, is that like we don't learn enough about her backstory. And I don't know if that was necessarily, it wasn't as crucial to the story this movie was telling, but I do feel like I filled in a lot of blanks in terms of like where she came from and what her background was and how the worldview that she was approaching the movie with, which wasn't necessarily explicit in the movie at all. Like you really have to hunt for side comments and like her family, like just like quick shots of her family and stuff like that to sort of infer where like how Patrick and Art are coming from a place of privilege and she's not. And again, that might not be true, but like that's sort of the impression that I got. And so I don't know, I really appreciated her too. Obviously, like her being so hyper focused on her own ambitions is not healthy. I acknowledge that. But I really identified with her. It's really, throughout the movie. I do feel like
Diana Nyad.
And, oh no. No, Diana Nyad is a sociopath. Like
well, wait a minute.
She kind of is, I guess. Oh no. I'm gonna really have to do some soul searching after this conversation, I guess.
If we go 35 years without Zendaya winning a Academy Award, maybe you'll look at her the same way that you look at Annette Bening. Both of you, more sympathy for Antonio, less sympathy for Jen.
Right. But I did sympathize with Art the most because I feel like out of the three of them, relatively, he's not entirely innocent, but he is the most innocent character. And I feel like he just really wanted to have a happy, quiet life with Zendaya, and like, and wanted to do what she wanted him to do. And like, I just felt bad for him more, because it seems like he was actually the most collateral damage out of the whole situation. But yeah, I don't know. What about everybody else?
Patrick was my favorite. um, and okay, but hear me out on this, because Art, I see what you're saying about Art, but Art, um, I think it's also a purposeful name for Art, because he's like the most artful both on the tennis court, but also in the way that he sort of, manipulates Tashi, like in their younger sort of days, right? Like he's very calculating in the way that he's going about things, right? Um, so I think that it's true that he's the most sort of like there's the most depth in his love for Tashi. Um, but what I liked about Patrick was that he seemed the most sort of like honest, the most honest with himself. I mean, he's flawed and he's fallible, but he doesn't pretend not to be. And I found him just like really charming, right? Um, and so I don't know, I sympathize with it. Like there are moments where he's just like a jerk and he has that smirk on his face and you can see it. Um, but there are moments of like woundedness in him too that I also felt for him the most in those moments, right? Like Tashi, I rarely had much sympathy for Tashi, even though I found her like a fierce and like fun character to watch. Um, Art was a little too like what's the term like students use? Simp, like a like someone who's just like, right? Like the most like I think multiple times he said something like, "Who wouldn't be in love with you?" And I was like, ah. Right? So Patrick I found to be the most to be the most sympathetic for me. What about you, PT?
As a simp, I liked Art. But no, I do agree with everything you're saying. Like Patrick was the one that was just like, I live my life the way I'm going to live my life. And kind of as time goes on, recognizing that this is, maybe not the best choice, but he can't make any other choice. And, but yeah, I mean, I was more rooting for Art because it felt like he was the most kind of swept up in things. And so I was kind of like, I want you to sort of be able to control what you can control while recognizing that his machinations did, create the wave, kind of like he wanted this to happen, or at least he thought he wanted it to happen. And when he has openings to be kind and magnanimous, he is not. So I don't want to make it seem like I think Art is a good character. Like I think that sauna scene when he's just sort of like, you're beneath me. Like this is not, that's obviously partially his wounded ego. That's partially,
he feels threatened.
There's lots of pain in there and he's threatened. But it's also, it's also still really crappy because he is, a multimillionaire many times over. He's very successful in lots of material ways. And if he doesn't know how kind of destitute Patrick is when the movie is beginning, he must at least suspect. He knows that like he's more successful. So, he could have gone a different way and then he didn't. And I get it. So I don't fully endorse Art per se. But yeah,
I don't think you can endorse any of these three characters.
No,
that's
of
the
course.
point.
And our prediction was also that Greg was team Art, or at least mine was that he would also be team Art. That we, he's the nerdiest of them all, and we're the nerds, so we thought that he would also be in favor of Art.
That makes sense. I mean, you could argue that Tashi's injury is his fault. You could. I don't know if I would, but you could. Because if you traced him sort of playing them off each other and trying to get them to break up, then they have that big fight.
I see.
She goes to play the match. Arguably, there's nothing in the movie that says this, to be clear. I'm reading between the lines big time. But you could argue that she's off her game and therefore injures herself because she had that big fight with Patrick, which she's only having because Art is sort of like poking the fire and being like, hey, like, you don't care about each other, right? So he doesn't come out of this clean at all. I don't think.
No. I mean this with full sincerity and not trying to be snarky. The version of this movie that is in Jen's head is a 5-star movie. like the movie that Jen saw is a lot deeper and has a lot more layers of meaning than the experience that I had, and I don't think that's because that movie isn't there. I wish I could have watched this through your eyes and been like seen these all the notes of the symphony, because I'm buying it. It's interesting. I like that.
And that honestly is why I had the most fun with it, because it gave me space to sort of like try to overinterpret everything and piece it all together, which I love when movies do that. I love it when they invite me to sort of like try to solve the mystery alongside them. This is just a relationship mystery, not a murder mystery or whatever. Thankfully, it doesn't end with a murder mystery.
I don't think it would be a mystery. I think it would have been very clear.
Oh, that's true. It would be very public. That's very funny.
I will also say, I have now I have a question that just came up, and then I have one last thing to put out. But Jen, did you think the final sequence, like the very final, like the last minute, was potentially going to end in violence? Because I never crossed my mind until Antonio said it here.
There was a moment a little bit before that where I thought it would end with, there's one shot where I can't remember now, but there was a moment where I was like, oh, is Art gonna punch Patrick?
Okay.
Because they had sort of been ramping up the anger. But I thought that was a possibility, but I didn't really think. I guess the short answer is no. It didn't really occur to me that the ending would be like the dark, like one punches the other to death or something. You know what I mean? Like that Antonio was sort of suggesting was possible. I did, however, the big moment of suspense for me, or not suspense, but like I think in my Letterboxd review I mentioned that I was like literally holding my hands over my face while watching the last 20 minutes of this movie, and it's because I knew that Patrick, well before he did, I knew that Patrick was going to do the racket signal, because again, they had seeded that so well in the beginning. It was Chekhov's racket move. Like it was
right.
Where it was like, well, clearly this is going to come back into play later to reveal that they have been together. Right. I just didn't know where or when. And so once I realized that was going to be the thing that sort of changes the match dramatically in some way, then I was just bracing myself for that moment. And I was actually more worried about that than I was about like them hurting each other physically.
It's interesting because I also like once it was clear that I think it's basically once Zendaya like took out the phone number and called Patrick, I was like, oh, that's what's gonna happen, is they're gonna hook up and then they're gonna okay. And I was a little like, that was kind of like the build up to that was when I was a little bit like, I'm kind of out on this. Like I get it. Like I get what's gonna happen. It's fine. But then that moment happened, and it was, I don't want it to be like I was smarter than everyone else in the theater, but like so many people in our theater reacted because like did not see it coming. It seemed like, or they saw it coming, but they were like, "Oh, it's happening." And there was like a very vocal reaction, and I was like, "Okay, like this works." And that from that point on, I was like, "I'm back in." Even with the weird tennis ball cam and the hardcore Henry sequences at the in the match from that point on. But yeah, it was. I liked that. I like that sort of setup of it, and them paying it off. So the only time I was worried about violence, which again I think is maybe speaks to me being worried that this was going to go even further afield than where it did, was I was like, oh, is this going to be like Art kills himself? Like he's like, I don't want to play tennis anymore. Like that's the violence I thought could happen. But then I was like, that wouldn't make sense for this movie to go out beyond this match. Like the end point chronologically of this movie has to be either towards the end or the end of this match. And that would have to happen, of course, afterwards. So I wasn't that worried about it. But yeah, Antonio, I liked the idea that like the jumping over the net was just going to be him, like, instead of breaking a racket, just breaking the racket on Patrick's face. I like that you were very worried about that.
I was very worried about that.
Well, there's one part where he hits the ball and it actually whizzes by Patrick's head.
Yes.
And so I was like, did he do that on purpose? Like, is he trying to hit him in the face with a tennis ball? So that was the only time when I was like, wait, what? But so I would buy that the movie, if people thought the movie was trying to that as a red herring, like suggesting that could happen, and that was part of the suspense of the final scene.
Yes. The my last, I feel like I'm just sitting here being the like petulant person about the movie.
No, we invite your critical.
Do you remember when do you remember May December? That movie was great. I like that movie. Do you remember when people were mad about the music in May December because they didn't get that it was like cheesy?
You want to talk about the score? Okay,
that's what the score sounded like to me. Was the people who the score in this movie to me sounded like the way that people didn't like May December's music felt about May December's music. And I'm because of the ending, I'm wondering if like, oh, maybe I was supposed to think this is like goofily over the top, like it's so insane, but it was just sort of like, yeah, I get it. Here comes that like the music again because they're mad at each other and they feel tension. It was, I felt like it undermined, like, and the sauna scene is the one that really kind of like bothered me the most because it felt like such a good moment of the two of them, and then suddenly it's just like and I was like, all right, like I get it, like he's mad. Like it was just, and again, I think that like over the topness is what people like about it, but I was just like, nah.
So do you feel like people could have the same debate about camp that people had with May December? Because remember that whole thing about like what is camp?
Maybe I did see someone call it, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, but they were like, because of the score and because of how operatic the performances were, or the sort of the plot was, that it's like an Italian giallo horror movie, that it's like, it's just everything is like really ramped up to that degree. So I don't know if that quite is the same as camp, but I think that, it's in that, maybe it's supposed to be in that zone of like intentionally over the top. But I don't know. I kind of felt like it was papering over. Again, it felt like it was papering, like really sort of like putting just big arrows about just like, do you see these emotions? When the performances and the structure of everything that was happening seemed to be doing a perfectly fine job of that. I don't know, like, again, maybe it's just because I wasn't on the right wavelength for part of the movie, that it felt too over the top, but that was my reaction to it.
So I would concede that there were moments where I was like, and the sauna, I think, is one of them probably, but where I was like, oh, do we need to do that again? So I would totally understand if someone was like, the move of the loud sort of the club music is overused. Like I can kind of see that argument, but to me, actually, just I liked the music itself enough that I feel like I just liked how it infused everything with so much energy. And I mentioned earlier that like the filmmaking of this has a lot of swagger, and I think the score is a huge part of that, where it's just like, I don't know, like, and again, it's fighting against that stereotype of tennis as like a country club sport. Like it's not the music I expected, and therefore I was like, oh, this is really interesting. But I can understand if individual moments don't totally work all the time in terms of when that music is employed. But I just really like, so this I liked the sort of Euro synth kind of flavor of it, like just as something to listen to. I found it very appealing, and like it reminded me a lot of this, and I don't know if they've made any music since like 2010, but there's a Brazilian group called CSS, which apparently stands for, it's I think Portuguese for I'm tired of being sexy. Which I feel like that like fits this movie really well. And to me, I could see, I don't know if it's actually an influence, but to me, it reminded me a lot of their music. The song that they're most famous for, it was like an iPod commercial a long time ago, or I think one of their biggest hits is called "Music Is My Hot Hot Sex." And so if you heard that, you'd be like, oh, this is like a iPhone ad for like the early 2000s or whatever. So, but anyway, that's just musically, that's what it brought me back to when I was listening to that and really enjoying it.
Yeah, I should know. I like the like as music. It's also interesting. It felt the most Nine Inch Nails of any Reznor Ross score. And I appreciate that. Like, I like Nine Inch Nails. And so that's fun. And I like that heavy synth music. It was more the degree to which it was used and all the context, which, you know, again, I'm wondering if watching this movie again, knowing that it ends in just, why don't you just hug? Why don't you stop playing tennis and you hug? That maybe all the other things I had a problem with are going to be like, okay, that's actually, this tracks with what is really going on in this movie.
Antonio, what did you think?
I too liked the music. I also thought that it was employed a little bit too much. I think that it the number of times it's employed maybe didn't trust that we wouldn't find the tennis scenes themselves to be enough, and that some viewers might find them sort of monotonous, and that we need the infusion of the audio in order to be invested. But I didn't find that to be the case. Like, I enjoyed the tennis. I think they did actually a pretty good job of representing it. There were a few times where the arc of the ball came off the racket, and I was like, "That's out." Right? There's no way that that's going to land in. But beyond that, I thought that when the way that they framed the actors and the way that they framed the tennis, again, like, I like tennis, right? So I don't mind. I can watch an extended sequence of it. I wish they played a little bit more with actually their differing styles, because that's kind of fun to watch, right? So, so yeah, I liked the music, but I think I agreed to a certain degree that with both of you that it was overused.
I want to agree with what Antonio was saying. Like, there were never sort of shots of the actors, the main actors, volleying back and forth without any cuts, because I don't think they ever got to the point of being that good at tennis where they can do that, which is, similar to if someone learns to, I learned how to hit all the notes on in a guitar. They still don't they didn't make Michael J. Fox play Johnny Be Good on the soundtrack live when he was filming it. But I think that it was just like they did such an impeccable job of looking like these are for real tennis players between, again, and you both have better eyes for this than I do, but I was impressed during the movie of feeling like, yep, like there's never a moment like a relatively famous one is in an otherwise excellent baseball movie, Bull Durham. Tim Robbins looks like he has never thrown a ball in his life when he's pitching, and it's just sort of like that. No pitcher could possibly succeed if that's your windup. And it never felt like that. It always was like, yep, like they know what they're doing, and they know how to do this. And I thought they did a really good job of embodying that. The performances were really incredible in that regard, and by extension, the directing and editing.
I saw a really fun behind the scenes video online that was like Zendaya with one of the tennis coaches that they trained with, and she's basically like trying to mimic every move on the court. So it's like they're like practicing the footwork part. It's really impressive. Because it's almost like she's learning a dance. Like,
yeah.
All right, I think we're ready to close out with Oscars Watch. All right, so do we feel like this actually has a shot at any Oscar nominations? I'm on the fence. I liked it a lot, but I don't know if it's Oscars is the Academy's going to go for this at all.
I say no. I liked it a lot too, and I think no. What are you, PT?
I mean, I still could see a Zendaya campaign if it's a soft year because we don't know what movies are coming out, and she's got Dune Part 2. She has this, like, her star is on the rise. Like, could we get to that point where it gets to be November, December, January, maybe some of the other presumed Best Actress front runners, which I don't even know what they are right now, but the ones that have been sort of built up over the summer, people are like, I don't know, that movie, we don't know. Is there going to be a actually, what about Zendaya and Challengers? And hearkening back to that. But I think it would be a star power based one. So it would either be
Right. It would
Zendaya.
be like she'd get nominated for this, but really it's also for Dune.
Right. It's sort of a like year, and also a kind of, isn't it time like we sort of up, level up her status in Hollywood, and make her Academy Award nominated. I also think, despite all my attacks and reservations, like it's possible that it could get a score nomination. Reznor and Ross get nominated pretty consistently. I don't know if they have another score coming out this year, but it feels like, it's John Williams, Thomas Newman. If they've got a score, it's like, well, like people are going to give it like a bunch of extra looks. And I think that Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross are in that conversation. So if this becomes, especially if this becomes like, it's played in the clubs, people are like, this gets like, it exists in the music world outside of just something from a movie. It could be something there, but yeah, I think it's just sort of fringe nominations, and it's on the outside looking in at this point. And it's dependent on there being gaps come nomination time.
So Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, just for context, they've won twice, Social Network and Soul, and they were also nominated for Mank. So they have a pretty good track record, as PT said.
They do. I mean, and in Mank, they lost to themselves because like Soul.
Oh, that's right.
Soul was nominated against Mank. So
if I don't think that either of the two, like Josh O'Connor or Mike Feist, are really strong contenders. But if one of the two ended up nominated, which one do you think was more likely?
I feel like people are more charmed by Josh O'Connor's performance, and so I think he's the better fit for supporting actor. You know what I mean? That kind of character actor slot.
He feels more clip-tastic. Like you can pull out moments of him doing something.
It's just him staring at the breakfast sandwich on the desk.
Right. So I did consider at one point in my Letterboxd review being tag yourself in the awkward product placement. I'm the Dunkin' Donuts bagel sandwich, or the Applebee's parking lot. But yeah, I think he's, because he has that like roguish rake quality, that I think that he's more likely to get pulled out for this. But I don't know. I feel like this movie would be a little bit more like star power based. Is there a possibility for screenplay?
So there is. Oh, and I can't believe I didn't bring this up earlier. So there is. So the screenplay is written by Justin. I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly. Kurwitz, I want to say.
Kuritzkis?
That sounds. There's an extra syllable I'm forgetting. Yeah. So he is actually married to Celine Song.
Yeah.
And both of their movies are about love triangles. So I really want their memoir to come out. And both of their movies, the husband is named Art, or like in past lives it's Arthur, right? So that feels too coincidental to not be a thing. But I don't know. Like I've heard people critique the screenplay because they don't like the ping-ponging structure, and that they don't. And if you don't like the ending, I think you fault the screenplay for that mostly. But I don't know. It would kind of feel like Air, like when people were talking about Air getting in screenplay, it would sort of feel like that kind of,
Yeah, that's a good.
But I like the screenplay a lot, and I feel like the screenplay is largely responsible for the version of the movie, the 5-star version of the movie that I saw. So, yeah, but yeah, so I think it's possible. He's also writing Luca Guadagnino's next movie with Daniel Craig. I think it's called Queer. So
based on a William S. Burroughs novel.
That's right. So that one actually probably would be more likely just because it's an adaptation of a famous novel. I would say that like if you're both talking about sort of fringe nominations on the outside, like keep a little bit here, a little bit there. But I feel like it really depends on what happens for the rest of the year. Like if it's a thinner year for the Best Picture 10, I feel like it's almost like an all or nothing. Like either this movie gets a Best Picture nomination, Zendaya gets nominated for actress, and then the screenplay gets nominated. You know what I mean? Like I feel like it has to be either that or like nothing.
Yeah. I was wondering, because has it happened since they expanded out to 10 again, like recently, that there's a movie that only got a Best Picture nomination?
I think it's always been one other is like the lowest.
Yeah. Because I believe I saw that did happen back in like the 30s, back when there were 10 in the early days of the Oscars. There were 1 or 2 times when that did happen, but I don't think it's happened since then. It could happen, like theoretically. Again, if the year ends up being light, and I feel like we keep saying that, and we also keep being like, but we're excited for this movie and that movie and that movie. So, it's, we'll have to see how it unfolds, but wouldn't that be fun? We can take this clip and then play it if it does happen.
At the very least, this is getting the treatment that Saltburn got at the BAFTAs, where it like doesn't get nominated for very much or doesn't win anything, but they're going to play the song. You know what I mean? Like that they're going to show clips from it and play the song in the montages and
show Zendaya a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And well, the thing is, if they were smart, Zendaya was a producer on this movie. So like really all they would need to do, they wouldn't need to nominate her an actress. If they didn't want to, they just would need to do a Best Picture nomination and she would be Oscar nominated.
I was going to say, having just watched Call Me By Your Name last night after seeing this movie, that was discussed off mic beforehand. That finally seeing Call Me By Your Name actually made me like more angry at Saltburn, because I was like, oh, you already had seen the better version of this. Like you'd already like I didn't have that context when I saw Saltburn. I was like, oh, you're just trying to make you thought you could twist it. You thought you could kind of spin but like, why would you do that? Why would you take it and spin it that way? How dare you?
Watching Challengers, I definitely had the thought of like, this is sort of what I wanted Saltburn to be, and it wasn't. So I'll be really curious to hear Greg's take later on, because he is a fan of Saltburn, not a fan of May December, not totally a fan of this movie. So like, what is this triangulation of like salacious stories? Like what, like, what does that mean? But maybe it's just a good personality test. So I also should mention Call Me By Your Name only won adapted screenplay, but it was not. Timothée Chalamet was nominated. It got Best Original Song. And I was like, Luca Guadagnino just has really good taste in music, because it was this Sufjan Stevens song. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right. That was a good song. And then it got a Best Picture nomination too. So, Luca Guadagnino has a pretty good track record at the Oscars as well. So,
although Bones and All was Bones and None at the Academy Awards.
Oh, that's true.
So they're also okay.
But this is clearly, Challengers is clearly his most commercial movie so far. So I feel like that's true. Actually bumps up his stock for Oscars potential. But yeah, we'll see. I don't know. But this might be the type of movie this is, might not be Oscar fair. All right.
Yeah. It's the weak year is the reason why.
Right. That would be, I totally agree. That's the only reason we're even having this conversation, as opposed to being like, no.
Right.
But yeah. So yeah, we'll have to see. All right. Well, thank you both for helping us unpack this movie. And I like that we had a diversity of takes. Antonio, thank you for bringing all your tennis knowledge. I claim to have watched a lot of tennis. I don't claim to have known a lot about tennis as a result. So I really appreciated hearing all of the knowledge. And PT, I appreciated hearing about why the parts of the movie that didn't totally work for you. I think that definitely helps me understand it too. Antonio, where can people find you?
They can find me on Letterboxd at A Elefano. PT, where can they find you?
They can also find me on Letterboxd at PT McNiff, PTMCNIFF. And they can find the show there at LTR Pod. And then, as mentioned earlier, you can find us on Instagram and Threads at The Long Take Review, or you can just follow and subscribe and give a rating and a review anywhere where you get your podcasts.
You can find me at Subchakchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI on Instagram and Threads, and Qui-Gon Jen on Letterboxd. Game, set, match. You gotta be calm. You gotta end with the sports metaphor. These are actual sports metaphors I can make. So.
Thanks for listening. You can follow
follow The Long Take Review on Substack at thelongtake.substack.com. Subscribe for free to receive new podcast episodes as well as written reviews of films with Oscar buzz and new films and series from pop franchises like Star Wars and Marvel.